Welcome, everyone, to our deep dive into the world of macroeconomics. We'll be using N. Gregory Mankiw's Macroeconomics as our guide.
Oh, that's a great choice. A classic.
Yeah, and we'll be trying to help you get a better grasp on how this all works. You know, how those big picture ideas we hear about actually show up in our daily lives.
Right, right.
Like when you see those headlines about economic growth, or maybe even just like the price of your morning coffee.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes it feels like those things are totally disconnected from these huge economic forces,
Yeah.
but really they're, all tied together.
Yeah, and get this, we'll even find out how a World War II prisoner of war camp actually ended up with their own unique currency.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So let's get started. Okay, first things first. What exactly is macroeconomics?
Well, you can think of it as the study of the economy as a whole.
Mm.
So instead of zeroing in on just, one specific market, we're kind of like zooming out to look at things like national income or like prices across the whole country or the overall unemployment rate.
So it's kind of like instead of looking at one tree, we're looking at the whole forest.
Exactly. And just like you'd need different tools to explore a forest, economists use all sorts of different models to understand the economy, right? To figure out how these different pieces work. Mankiw actually talks about this, having like a Swiss Army knife of tools for economists.
Makes sense. So how do economists measure something as big as a national economy? I mean, what are they even looking at?
Well, they use a few key things, metrics like GDP, CPI, and the unemployment rate. These give them a good snapshot of how healthy the economy is.
Gotcha. Okay. So can you break down some of those for us? Like starting with GDP, what exactly does that measure?
So GDP stands for gross domestic product. And basically it measures the total value of all the goods and services produced within a country's borders. So that's everything from cars to haircuts to, financial services.
So like if I buy a new phone or a company builds a new factory, that all adds to the GDP.
You got it. And there are actually a couple of ways to calculate it. You can add up all the income earned during the production process, or you can add up all the spending on final goods and services. And it's really interesting because it shows how income and spending are like constantly flowing through the economy.
And then there's CPI, right? I know that has something to do with prices, but how is it different from the GDP deflator? Because they both seem to be measuring like changes in price.
Right. So the CPI, that stands for Consumer Price Index. It focuses specifically on the prices of stuff that the average consumer buys. So, things like housing, groceries, transportation, healthcare, stuff like that. And then the GDP deflator, on the other hand, looks at the prices of all goods and services produced in the country, not just the ones consumers buy.
So CPI is kind of like measuring the direct impact of price changes on people's wallets.
You could say that, yeah. Like, imagine the price of imported cars suddenly shot up. Well, that would show up in the CPI because people buy those cars.
Mm.
But it wouldn't directly impact the GDP deflator because those cars weren't actually made in the country, right?
Gotcha. So the CPI is more about that, like, ouch, my wallet feeling,
Good.
while the GDP deflator gives us a broader picture of prices across the whole economy.
Yeah, exactly. Both are important, but it's good to know the difference.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, let's move on to something that's always kind of fascinated me, the factors of production. I remember Mankiw talked about how these elements really influence a country's output. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. So the way Mankiw describes it, the main ingredients in production are capital, labor, and technology. Capital is, all the tools, machinery, infrastructure, stuff that's used to make things. And then labor, that's pretty straightforward. It's the workforce, the people who are doing the work. And then you have technology, which is all those innovations and advancements that make us more efficient. Like think about how much more we can produce now compared to 100 years ago, thanks to technology.
So it's not just about having more workers or machines, but also about how efficiently those things work together. And that's where technology comes in.
Exactly. It all comes together to determine a country's productive capacity. Mankey uses this thing called the Cobb-Douglas production function to model that.
Right. So, like, a country could have a lot of workers and machines, but if their technology is outdated, they're not going to be as productive, right?
Well, imagine a construction crew with tons of strong workers and, some basic tools. But if they're still using shovels instead of excavators, they're not going to be able to build as much.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, what about the income generated from all this production? How's that divided up between these different factors?
So basically, workers get paid wages for their labor based on how much they contribute to production. And then people who own capital, they get income through the rental price of their capital. So it's like a return on their investment for providing those tools and machinery.
So, if a country suddenly had a huge influx of workers, like through immigration, could that affect wages?
That's a great question. And yeah, absolutely. And Mankiw uses historical examples to illustrate exactly that. More workers can put downward pressure on wages, while a sudden influx of capital from, say, foreign investors could actually decrease the rental price of capital.
It's like a constant push and pull between these factors.
Exactly. They're all interconnected.
Now, let's talk about something that I always find super interesting: money. It's more than just the bills and coins in our wallets, right?
Absolutely. Money is kind of the backbone of any economy. Mankiw really highlights three key functions. It's a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value.
Okay, can you unpack that a bit? What do those functions actually mean, like in the real world?
Well, think about how we use money every day. It's a medium of exchange because we use it to buy stuff, right? To pay for goods and
Yeah.
services. And it's a unit of account because it provides a common measure of value. So we can compare the prices of different things. And it's a store of value because we can hold on to it and then use it later to buy things in the future.
So it's like money is this language we use to talk about value, and it lets us trade with each other.
Precisely. And what's fascinating is that money can actually take so many different forms. Like Mankiw tells this crazy story about a World War II POW camp where they actually started using cigarettes as currency.
Wait, cigarettes? How did that even work?
Well, the prisoners needed something to trade with, some way to measure the value of stuff and even to store their wealth. And because cigarettes were scarce but everyone wanted them, they kind of naturally became the go-to form of money.
Wow, that's wild. It really shows how money is about trust and like a shared understanding of value, even if it's, cigarettes in a POW camp.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That story really drives home the point that money doesn't have to be gold or, paper bills. It can be anything that a society agrees on as a means of exchange.
Right. We've gone from bartering to like commodity money, like gold and silver, to now, we have this fiat money, which is basically just backed by the government's word. And now we're even seeing all these near money assets like credit cards. It's like the whole idea of money is evolving right before our eyes.
It definitely is. It's an exciting time to be studying money and banking. And that actually leads us perfectly into our next topic. We've talked about the domestic economy, but how about the open economy? How countries interact through trade and things like that. After all, no country is an island.
That's a great point. Let's unpack that in the next part of our deep dive. Okay, so we've talked about the basics, like how economists measure the economy, those factors of production, and even that wild story about cigarette money in that POW camp.
It's crazy, right?
Yeah. So now let's get into how countries interact on like a global scale. When we say open economy, what does that actually mean?
Well, an open economy is one that trades with other countries. They're buying and selling goods and services across borders, and there's this flow of capital too, with investments and things. It's like imagine each country specializing in what they're good at.
Right, playing to their strengths.
Exactly. Just like, people benefit from trading with each other, countries can benefit from specializing and trading with each other. It leads to more efficiency, and everyone can kind of get better off in the end.
Makes sense. But there are always like potential downsides too, right? I remember Mankiw used the US trade deficit as a good example.
Right, so a trade deficit happens when a country imports more than it exports. So in the U.S. case, it means Americans are buying more stuff from other countries than they're selling to them.
So it's kind of like spending more money than you're making. That doesn't seem sustainable.
Yeah, and that's the worry. To pay for this deficit, the U.S. has been borrowing money from other countries, basically racking up debt. And while that might let us, enjoy more stuff in the short term, it raises questions about, like, what happens in the long run.
Right. So it's not an immediate crisis, but it's something to keep an eye on. It could have big implications down the road.
Definitely. It's a complex issue. Now, you mentioned capital flowing across borders earlier. That sounds a lot like investment, right?
Yeah.
Well, investment is super important for economic growth. It's how we create new factories, machinery, all that stuff that helps us produce more in the future. And this investment can come from within a country, but in an open economy, it can come from foreign investors too.
Yeah.
They see opportunities and they put their money in.
So foreign investment can actually be a good thing. It brings in money, creates jobs, helps businesses grow.
Exactly. And it goes both ways. Like countries with extra savings, they might invest in other countries that have, good potential for growth. It's all part of this interconnected global economy. Mankey actually breaks down investment into a few different categories. There's uh, business fixed investment, residential investment, and inventory investment. Any guesses what those might be?
Hmm. Okay, let me think. Business fixed investment, that's got to be when companies spend money on new factories and equipment, right?
Got it.
And then residential investment, I'm guessing that's probably about building new houses and apartments.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so what about inventory investment? I'm not really sure about that one.
So that one refers to the changes in the stock of goods that businesses hold. It's basically about managing the flow of goods through production and getting them ready for sale.
Oh, okay. So like if a business is stocking up on inventory, that might mean they're expecting, to sell a lot more stuff soon.
Exactly. It's one of the many signals economists use to get a sense of how the economy is doing.
Speaking of signals, what about the stock market? Everyone always talks about that like it's some kind of crystal ball for the economy. But Mankey points out that, it's not always that reliable.
Yeah, the stock market is notoriously fickle. It's influenced by so many different things, investor psychology, rumors, even like global events that might not even have anything to do with the actual economy.
So sometimes it's more about like emotions than actual economic fundamentals.
You could say that. Mankey actually uses this really cool analogy, Keen's beauty contest. It's this idea that stock market investors are like trying to predict what everyone else thinks is going to be valuable, rather than just focusing on the actual value of the companies themselves.
Oh, so it's like you're trying to guess who's going to win a beauty pageant based on like what you think the judges will like, not on your own taste.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It shows how psychology can really mess with things in the stock market.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit. What about banks? I mean, they're more than just a place to stash your paycheck, right?
Oh, absolutely. Banks are crucial for economic growth. They act like intermediaries between people who have money to save and people who want to borrow money to invest in new businesses or, buy houses and things.
So they're like the matchmakers of the financial world, connecting savers with borrowers.
Exactly. And they do this through something called fractional reserve banking, which is actually how they can create money.
Hold on, banks can create money. How does that even work?
I know, it sounds kind of crazy. So when you put money in a bank, they don't just hold on to all of it, right? They keep a little bit in reserve just in case you want to take some out. But then they lend the rest of it to borrowers.
Mm-hmm.
And those borrowers, they spend that money and it ends up in other banks who then lend out a chunk of it and so on. It's this chain reaction.
Wow, so that initial deposit can actually lead to like way more money circulating in the economy.
Exactly. It's a pretty powerful system. But it's also why we need, good regulations to make sure everything stays stable.
That makes sense. We've definitely seen what happens when things get out of control in the banking system. Now, what about central banks? They play a big role in managing the money supply and like keeping the economy on track, right? What are some of the tools they use to do that?
Well, they have a few tricks up their sleeves. One is open market operations, which basically means they can buy or sell government bonds too, to adjust the amount of money in the system. Then there are reserve requirements, which tell banks how much of those deposits they have to hold on to rather than lending out. And then there's the discount rate, which is the interest rate banks have to pay if they borrow money from the central bank.
It sounds complicated.
It definitely is. It's like they're constantly tweaking these levers and trying to find that sweet spot where they can keep inflation under control, but also keep the economy growing. It's not always easy, though.
Right, because there are always trade-offs, right?
Always. Speaking of tough topics, let's talk about government debt.
Ooh, yeah, that's always a fun one.
I know, right? Mankiw actually dedicates a whole chapter to this, looking at what's happening in the U.S. historically and also what's going on in other countries.
So let's start with the basics. What exactly is government debt?
Okay, so government debt is basically the sum of all those past budget deficits. A budget deficit happens when the government spends more than it brings in through taxes and other revenue. So to cover that gap, they borrow money. They issue these bonds, which are basically like IOUs promising to pay back the money later with interest. And over time, those deficits can really add up.
So it's kind of like if a household spends more than it earns and has to rack up credit card debt.
Exactly. And just like with that credit card debt, if it gets too big, it can become a real problem.
Now, Mankey mentioned that the U.S. debt to GDP ratio has gone up and down a lot throughout history, especially spiking during wars. Why is that?
Yeah, well, wars are expensive, right? Governments have to borrow a ton of money to fund the war effort, and that pushes up the debt. World War II is a classic example. The U.S. debt exploded during the war, but then after the war, it gradually came down as the economy boomed.
But in recent decades, we've seen this big increase in debt, even though we haven't had, like, a major war. What's driving that?
Well, there are a few things. Tax cuts, increased spending on social programs, the cost of dealing with economic crises like the Great Recession a while back. It's all added up.
So it's not just one thing, it's a combination of factors.
Right. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of debate about whether this rising debt is a big problem or not.
What are some of the concerns people have?
Some economists worry that all this debt will burden future generations. They'll have to pay higher taxes or maybe there'll be less money for things like education and infrastructure because so much is going towards paying off the debt. But then others say that, government debt can be a good tool to boost the economy, especially when things are slow. And they argue that if the economy grows fast enough, it can kind of outgrow the debt problem.
So there are valid points on both sides. It's not a simple issue.
Exactly. And it's actually even more complicated than that because, you know, measuring government debt isn't always straightforward. There are things like unfunded liabilities, which are basically promises the government has made for future spending, like Social Security and Medicare. But there's not enough money set aside to cover those promises right now.
Right. So it's like a looming bill that will eventually come due.
Exactly. It adds another layer of complexity to this whole debate.
Okay. So we've talked about trade, investment, the banking system, government debt. What about the people? How do their spending habits fit into all of this?
Ah, yes. Consumption. That's a huge driver of economic activity. Mankey takes us on a journey through different theories about how consumption works, starting with the ideas of John Maynard Keynes.
I've heard that name. Wasn't he like a super famous economist?
Oh yeah, one of the most influential of the 20th century.
Cool. So what did he have to say about consumption?
Well, Keynes argued that people's current income is the main thing that determines how much they spend.
So the more money you make, the more you spend. Seems pretty intuitive.
Right. He even came up with this simple equation for it called the consumption function. It basically says that consumption is determined by some base level of spending, even when you have zero income, plus a fraction of your disposable income. That fraction is called the marginal propensity to consume.
Okay, so if someone gets a raise, they're probably going to spend some of it and save some of it. Is that what that means?
Exactly. But Keynes also realized that income isn't the whole story. He said that people's feelings about the economy, their expectations about the future, all that stuff can play a role too.
So, like, if everyone's feeling optimistic, they might be more willing to spend money, even if their incomes haven't changed.
Precisely. It's all about how secure and confident people feel.
Makes sense. But didn't Mankiw say that there are, like, more modern theories about consumption now?
He did. Economists have, built upon Keynes' ideas. One important concept is this idea of intertemporal choice. It basically recognizes that people are thinking about not just how much to spend today, but also how much to save for the future.
Right, because you might want to enjoy some of that money now, but you also got to plan for, retirement and stuff. It's all about finding that balance.
Exactly. It's like, do you buy that new gadget you really want today, or do you put that money in your savings account so you can, travel the world when you retire? It's a classic dilemma.
Oh, I know that struggle.
I think we all do. So there are a couple of big theories that try to explain how people make these choices. There's the life cycle hypothesis, developed by Franco Modigliani, which suggests that people try to smooth out their consumption over their entire lifetime.
So, like, they might borrow money when they're young and just starting out, then save a lot during their prime working years, and then spend those savings when they're older and retired.
Exactly. It helps explain why, consumption doesn't always move in perfect sync with someone's current income. They're thinking about their lifetime earnings and trying to spread out their spending accordingly.
That's really interesting. And what about that other theory, the permanent income hypothesis?
Ah, yes. That one was developed by Milton Friedman, another economics rock star. He focused on the difference between permanent income and transitory income.
Yeah.
Permanent income is like the stable long-term part of your earnings, while transitory income is more temporary, like, a bonus or maybe an unexpected expense.
So it's the difference between, like, your regular salary and a one-time windfall.
Exactly. And Friedman argued that people mostly base their spending decisions on their permanent income. They kind of ignore those temporary changes.
It's like they're thinking long-term.
Right. They're looking at their overall financial picture, not just what's happening right now.
That makes a lot of sense. And I know there's been a lot of talk about behavioral economics lately. How does that fit into all of this?
Well, behavioral economics is this really cool field that challenges some of those traditional assumptions about how rational people are. It,
Mhm.
it acknowledges that we all have these psychological biases and that we don't always make the most logical decisions, especially when it comes to money.
So it's like acknowledging that we're human, not robots.
Exactly. Like one classic example is loss aversion. People hate losing money more than they like gaining the same amount. It's kind of weird, but it's true.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that.
Right. And this helps explain why sometimes people are really reluctant to cut back on their spending, even when maybe they should. Like if their income drops, they don't want to feel that loss.
That's a great example. It shows how, like, our psychology can really affect our financial decisions.
For sure. And all of these insights from behavioral economics are helping economists build even better models of how consumption works.
So we've gone from that simple consumption function to these more complex theories that factor in, like, time, expectations, and even our own psychology. It's amazing how much we've learned.
It really is. And all of this has big implications for policymakers who are trying to encourage people to save more.
Right, because if you understand what drives people to spend or save, you can try to nudge them in a certain direction with, like, tax policies or other incentives.
Exactly. Governments often try to do that because they know that saving is really important for long-term economic growth. It provides the funds for investment and all those things that help an economy thrive.
So it's about encouraging people to, like, delay gratification today so they can have a better tomorrow.
You got it.
Wow, this deep dive has been a whirlwind. We've covered so much. We talked about international trade, investment, the whole banking system, government debt, and now, how people make decisions about spending and saving. It's really eye-opening to see how all these pieces fit together.
It's been a blast exploring all this with you, and we've just scratched the surface, really. There's so much more to learn about macroeconomics.
Well, I definitely feel much more prepared to understand those news headlines now, about economic growth and inflation and all that.
That's what we like to hear. And remember economics is a constantly evolving field. There's always more to discover and new challenges to figure out, so stay curious.
Great advice. Thanks for joining us for this dip dive into macroeconomics. It's been fascinating. And to everyone listening, until next time, keep those minds engaged and those economies humming. Okay, so we've been through a lot in this deep dive. We've talked about how economies work, how they grow, the role of banks, government spending, all that. But I'm kind of curious about those, like, shorter term ups and downs that we see, those booms and busts that are always in the news.
Yeah, those are important too. We've been focusing on the long-term trends, but those short-term fluctuations, the business cycle as it's called, that can really impact people's lives.
Right, exactly. So how do economists try to understand those?
Well, one of the main tools they use is this model of aggregate supply and aggregate demand. It helps explain those short-term changes in output and prices.
So it's like we're zooming in on specific periods of, growth or contraction.
You got it. Now, aggregate demand, that's the total demand for goods and services in the economy at a given price level.
Huh.
It's influenced by things like consumer spending, how much businesses are investing, government spending, and net exports.
Okay, so if people are feeling good and spending money, or if businesses are investing a lot, that would boost aggregate demand.
Exactly. And the aggregate demand curve, it slopes downward, basically meaning that if prices fall, people can buy more stuff, so demand goes up. Think about it like if the price of your favorite latte suddenly dropped, you'd probably buy more,
Yeah,
right?
for sure. But what about aggregate supply? What's that all about?
So aggregate supply is the total amount of goods and services that firms are willing to produce and sell at a given price level. It depends on things like their cost of production, the technology they have, how many resources are available, things like that.
So, like, if a company figures out a way to produce something more efficiently, that would increase aggregate supply, right?
Right. Now, in the long run, most economists think that the aggregate supply curve is vertical, meaning that the total amount we can produce is basically determined by those fundamental factors of production we talked about earlier: capital, labor, technology. Prices might go up or down, but the total output stays pretty much the same.
So, in the long run, prices might fluctuate, but the amount of stuff we produce is kind of fixed.
That's the basic idea. But in the short run, things are a bit different. The short run aggregate supply curve actually slopes upward. So when prices rise, firms actually produce more.
Wait, why would they do that? Wouldn't that mean their costs are higher too?
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive. But there are a few reasons for this. One is sticky wages and prices. Sometimes wages and prices don't adjust right away when demand or supply changes. So if demand suddenly jumps, firms can increase their output and make more profit before wages and prices catch up.
Ah, so they're kind of taking advantage of that lag.
Right. Another reason is misperceptions about inflation. Like, if a firm sees that the price of its product is going up, they might think, oh, people must really want our stuff. But maybe it's just that prices are rising in general, right? So they might increase production when they don't really need to.
So they're misreading the signals.
Exactly. And then sometimes there are just these temporary supply shocks, like maybe a natural disaster or a sudden shortage of some key ingredient.
Yeah.
Those can reduce aggregate supply in the short term, leading to higher prices and less output.
Okay, so it sounds like this interaction between aggregate supply and aggregate demand can create a lot of instability in the short run.
It definitely can. And that's where this whole debate about economic stabilization comes in.
Right, because if the government could influence aggregate demand somehow, maybe through monetary policy or fiscal policy, maybe they could smooth things out a bit, prevent those big swings.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Hmm.
But it's not that simple. There are a lot of arguments against government intervention too.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, it's really hard to predict what's going to happen in the economy. Like, it's tough to know when a recession's coming or how bad it's going to be. And if the government acts based on, wrong information, their policies could actually make things worse.
So it's kind of like trying to fix your car engine when you don't really know what's broken.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
could really mess things up. Another worry is unintended consequences. Government policies can have all sorts of ripple effects, and it's hard to predict all of them. Like, you try to boost spending, but maybe you accidentally trigger a bunch of inflation.
So it's like a complicated game of chess. You have to think many moves ahead.
Exactly. And then there's this whole philosophical debate about whether, policymakers should have the freedom to do whatever they think is best, or if they should be bound by these strict rules.
Oh, right, the whole rules versus discretion debate.
Yeah. People who like rules, they say it creates more predictability and it prevents policymakers from doing things for political reasons instead of, what's good for the economy. But then others say, hey, you need some flexibility to deal with, unexpected events.
Sounds like a tough balance to strike.
It definitely is. There's no easy answer.
Now, I remember Mankey mentioning this thing called the Phillips curve. What was that all about?
Ah, yes. The Phillips curve. It shows the relationship between inflation and unemployment. For a long time, economists thought there was this stable trade-off between the two. Like policymakers could choose to have higher inflation and lower unemployment, or vice versa.
Oh, so it was like they could pick their poison.
Yeah, kinda. But as Mankiw explains, that turned out to be wrong. The relationship between inflation and unemployment is way more complicated, especially in the long run.
So why didn't it hold up?
Well, one big reason is expectations. If everyone expects prices to go up, they'll demand higher wages and businesses will raise their prices. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that can lead to this nasty situation called stagflation, where you have both high inflation and high unemployment.
Ouch, that doesn't sound good.
No, it's not. And that's why central banks try so hard to keep inflation under control.
Hmm.
They want to prevent those expectations from getting out of hand.
Right, because once inflation takes off, it's really hard to bring it back down.
Exactly. It's a constant challenge.
Wow, it seems like macroeconomics is just full of these tough trade-offs. There's no perfect solution for anything.
That's a really good observation. Economics is all about making choices when resources are scarce. There are always going to be trade-offs.
Well, this deep dive has definitely been a journey. We've gone from the basics of how we measure the economy to these really complex ideas about, long-term growth, short-term fluctuations, and the role of government. I feel like I have a much better grasp on how it all works now.
That's great to hear. It's been fantastic exploring these ideas with you. We've talked about money, banking, government debt, and how people make decisions about spending and saving. It's all connected.
I know, right? It's amazing how much we've covered.
And remember, economics is always changing. There's always something new to learn. So, keep asking questions and stay curious.
That's great advice. Well, thanks again for joining us for this deep dive into macroeconomics. It's been a blast. And to all our listeners, until next time, keep those minds engaged and keep learning.